Welcome to Chained Opinion Podcast, everybody. Today we're diving into a pretty unique story.
Yeah.
It's about discussions by some pretty high-up U.S. officials, regarding a planned military action.
Right, like top-level stuff.
Exactly. Top
Yeah.
level. And the thing is, these conversations, well, they kind of ended up in the public eye.
Which is, not ideal.
To say the least. So what we're going to do is we're going to break down all the details that have been reported about these discussions, try to understand how it all went down,
The when, the where, the why.
Exactly. We want to understand the different perspectives that were, floating around.
What were they thinking?
Yeah, what were they thinking? And our goal here is pretty simple. We want to give you, the listener, a complete and objective view of what's been reported. No spin, no bias.
Just the facts, man.
Just the facts. Oh, and before we jump in, don't forget to share, subscribe. You know the drill. Leaving comments really helps us out, too.
Yeah, spread the word.
And you can also find us on YouTube Music and Spotify if you prefer the audio-only version. Okay, so the big question is, how did all this become public? It seems like it all started with a leak.
Right. So the story goes that these discussions were accidentally shared in a Signal group chat.
Signal, like the messaging app.
Yep, that's the one. It's known for being, super secure, encrypted, and all that.
Right. Secure, except for when it's not, apparently.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
And the person who had accidentally included in this chat was Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic.
Oh, wow.
That's a big name to accidentally share top-secret military discussions with.
Huge. So how did people react when this leak happened?
Well, the reactions were pretty interesting. You had President Trump, for instance, trying to, downplay the whole thing.
Downplay it, how so?
He basically said, not a big deal. The whole thing. Those were his words. Kind of surprising, given the situation,
Yeah. A bit of an understatement, perhaps?
Okay, so let's try to piece together the timeline of these discussions as they've been reported. Seems like things started around March 13th. What happened then?
Well, from what's been reported, on March 13th, they were trying to set up a coordination group, specifically for dealing with the Houthis.
The Houthis.
Yeah. It looks like Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, was the point man on that, aiming to create what he called a tiger team.
A tiger team? Is that like a special forces unit?
No, not like that. This is more like a group of deputies and chiefs of staff from the different agencies involved,
I see. So a high-level think tank kind of thing.
Exactly. And the first step was to get points of contact from each team. Interestingly, names like Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, and Tulsi Gabbard pop up here. They apparently provided contact info for their staff to be part of this group.
Okay, so this was like the initial stage, setting the groundwork for more in-depth talks, right?
Right, laying the foundation for what was to come.
Got it. And those talks seem to have gotten, more serious on March 14th, just a day before the reported strike. What were the main points of agreement or disagreement at that stage?
Right, so March 14th, this is where it gets juicy. The big topic of discussion was something called the Statement of Conclusions. They were also putting together lists of allies to notify, standard procedure before an operation.
Makes sense. But this is also where the different viewpoints came out, right?
Oh, absolutely. And this is where it gets really interesting. For example, you had Vice President J.D. Vance. He expressed some serious concerns about the timing of the attack.
What kind of concerns?
Well, he was worried about, the impact on European trade. Remember, a huge chunk of U.S. and European trade goes through the Suez Canal.
Right, yeah.
And this attack, well, it could disrupt that flow big time.
Makes sense. Disrupting a major shipping route like that would have global consequences. Exactly. And Vance was also worried about oil prices, which would almost certainly spike if the situation escalated. It's a classic case of, balancing immediate military goals with the bigger economic picture.
Right. A short-term gain could lead to long-term pain.
Exactly.
Right.
And there's another key point that Vance brought up. He felt like this whole military action, it kind of clashed with the president's message towards Europe at the time.
So a mixed message, maybe even hypocrisy.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
But despite all these reservations, Vance said he was willing to go along with the team's decision, though he made it clear he wasn't happy about it.
So a reluctant yes, but a yes nonetheless.
Pretty much.
Sure.
And it wasn't just Vance who had concerns. Joe Kent, Tulsi Gabbard's chief of staff, he chimed in too.
What did Kent have to say?
Well, he basically agreed that there wasn't this urgent need to attack right away. He argued that they would probably have the same options available a month down the line,
So no need to rush into it, according to Kent?
Yeah. And he also brought up this interesting point about potential Israeli actions. He said that Israel might launch its own attacks against the Houthis, and then they'd probably ask the U.S. to, replenish their supplies.
Oh, interesting. So like a domino effect.
Right. And while he admitted it was a minor factor, it does show that they were considering the wider regional dynamics,
Yeah.
not just the immediate situation.
Makes sense. It's all connected, right? So we have concerns about the economy, about timing, and about potential blowback from other players in the region.
Yeah, a lot to consider. And then there's the intelligence angle. What did the CIA have to say about all this?
Good point. I'd imagine they'd have a pretty important perspective. What was their take?
So the CIA director, John Ratcliffe, he stepped in and gave their view. He said they were ready to provide support right away, boots on the ground, all that. But he also said that delaying the attack wouldn't really hurt their efforts.
Really? So the CIA wasn't pushing for immediate action?
Not necessarily. In fact, Ratcliffe suggested that having more time could actually help them get better intel, especially on the Houthi leadership.
Oh, I see. So a more patient approach could lead to better outcomes.
That was their thinking. So you have this interesting mix, right? Concerns about the economy, the strategic timing, the potential for better intel if they waited.
But surely there were strong voices pushing for the attack to go ahead. I mean, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, he seems to be firmly in that camp, right?
Oh, yeah. Hegseth was all for it. He made some pretty compelling arguments, too. His main point was that they needed to restore freedom of navigation in the Red Sea, which, he saw as a core national interest.
Makes sense. I mean, the Red Sea is a vital shipping route.
Huge. And Hegseth also talked about reestablishing deterrence. He felt like that had been weakened, and this attack was a way to show, that the U.S. meant business.
A show of force, basically.
Right. But here's the thing, and this is what we have to think about, was this particular action, in this way, the best way to achieve that goal of deterrence, especially given all the concerns that were being raised?
Yeah, good point. There's always the risk of unintended consequences.
Exactly. Now, on the timing issue and the messaging, well, Hegseth argued that it was going to be tough to sell this to the public no matter when they did it.
Why that?
Well, he said that most people don't even know who the Houthis are,
True, it's not exactly a household name.
Right. But Hegseth suggested focusing the message on, blaming the previous administration for the situation and highlighting Iran's role in funding the Houthis.
So kind of deflecting and simplifying the narrative.
Yeah, you could say that. Hegseth also mentioned two big risks if they delayed the attack.
What were they?
First, leaks. He was worried that if they waited, word might get out, and that would make the U.S. look indecisive, weak.
I see. And the second risk?
The second was Israel. Hegseth was worried that Israel might jump the gun and launch their own attacks first, or that the ceasefire in Gaza might collapse.
And that would force the U.S.'s hand, right?
Exactly. They'd lose control of the situation. So even though Hegseth acknowledged that they could pause, take a breather, he made it pretty clear that he thought they were ready to go, and if it was up to him, he'd pull the trigger.
So a pretty clear stance from Hegseth. What about the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz? Where did he stand on all this?
Okay, so Waltz, he kind of took a more big picture view. He talked about the huge volume of global trade going through the Red Sea, especially all the container ships.
Right, a major artery of global commerce.
Absolutely. He admitted it was hard to say exactly how much of that trade directly impacted the U.S., but he pointed out that a lot of those goods, they either go through the Red Sea or around the Cape of Good Hope before ending up in Europe.
Right, and then those goods get turned into stuff that's shipped to the U.S.
Precisely. It's all interconnected. And here's a key point that Waltz made. He said that European navies, they just don't have the firepower to deal with the Houthis' fancy missiles and drones,
So they're relying on the U.S. to keep those shipping lanes open.
Exactly. And Waltz saw an opportunity here. He suggested using this whole situation to pressure Europe to, step up their own defense game.
I see. Kind of like saying, look, we're cleaning up your mess, so you better start paying your fair share.
Yeah, something like that. He basically wanted to add this to the list of reasons why Europe should be spending more on defense, which, was in line with the president's thinking.
Interesting. So a mix of immediate security concerns and long-term strategic maneuvering. Did this sway J.D. Vance at all? He seemed pretty hesitant earlier.
Yeah, well, after hearing all these arguments, Vance kind of addressed Hegseth directly. He said something like, if you think we should do it, let's go. But he added, I just hate bailing Europe out again, which shows he was still uneasy about the whole thing.
Makes sense. And then what?
He went on to stress that they needed to be super careful with the messaging, to control the narrative. And he also wanted to do everything they could to protect Saudi oil facilities from any, retaliatory attacks.
Smart. Minimize the risks as much as possible.
Right. And Hegseth was totally on board with Vance's frustration about Europe not pulling their weight. He called it pathetic even. But he also agreed with Waltz that the U.S. was really the only one who could handle this.
Interesting how those two seemingly opposing viewpoints, Hegseth's hawkish stance and Waltz's more strategic approach, actually ended up supporting the same action.
Right. It's all about how you frame it, I guess. Anyway, Hegseth finished by saying that he felt like now was as good a time as any, given the president's order to reopen those shipping lanes. But he also mentioned that the president still had like 24 hours to make the final call.
Okay, so a lot of back and forth, different perspectives, but ultimately it seems like they were leaning towards action.
Yeah, that's the sense I get. Oh, and I almost forgot. Stephen Miller, who was supposedly the White House Homeland Security advisor at the time, he jumped into.
What did Miller have to say?
Well, he was all about getting something in return for all this effort,
Yeah.
what's in it for us kind of thing. He said that the president had given the okay, but he wanted to make it clear to Egypt and Europe what they had to do, what the U.S. expected in return for fixing this whole mess.
Interesting. So leverage the situation to extract concessions.
Exactly. And Miller even brought up the practical side of things, like how would they actually enforce this? He suggested that if Europe didn't play ball, there needed to be consequences.
Makes sense. You can't just make demands without any teeth, right?
Right. Miller finished by saying that if the U.S. was going to go through all this trouble to reopen those shipping lanes, well, they better get some economic benefit out of it. And Hegseth just agreed with him.
Okay, so lots of discussion, differing opinions, but ultimately it seems like they were moving towards action. And March 15th, that was the day of the actual strike, right?
Right. And this is where we get into some really specific details. Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, he sent a message labeled Team Update, which basically outlined the entire launch timeline.
Whoa, hold on. This message, it was like a live update of the military operation?
Yeah, pretty much. She listed times for everything. Confirmation of good weather and the go for launch from CENTCOM, which is the U.S. Central Command, the guys in charge of the Middle East.
Right. CENTCOM.
Then launch times for the first and second waves of F-18 fighter jets, launch time for the MQ-9 drones, even the estimated time for the first bombs to drop, though he said that depended on earlier targets. And then the launch time for the first Tomahawk missiles, those are the sea-launched ones.
Wow, incredibly detailed. Did he mention anything about security, operational security?
Yeah, he said they were clean on OPSEC at that point.
OPSS.
Operational security. Basically making sure no sensitive information gets out.
Got it. So he felt confident that everything was secure at that point, and then...
And then he wished Godspeed to our warriors. Pretty standard military stuff,
Yeah, I guess so. It's kind of surreal to hear this level of detail being shared, in this context. What about Vice President Vance? Did he say anything on that day?
Yes, shortly after those F-18s took off, Vance sent a message saying, "I will say a prayer for victory."
Okay. Short and to the point.
Yeah. And later on, Waltz, the National Security Advisor, he gave an update. He said there was a building collapse with multiple positive ID.
Positive ID, meaning?
Meaning they'd confirmed they'd hit the right targets. In a later message, Waltz clarified that the target was their top missile guy. They'd apparently tracked him going into his girlfriend's building, and then, boom, the whole thing came down.
Vance's response to that was simply, excellent.
And then the congrats started pouring in. Radcliffe from the CIA called it a good start. Rubio said good job to Hegseth and his team. Waltz gave credit to the folks in ML. I'm not sure what that refers to.
Me neither. Maybe some intelligence unit.
Could be. Anyway, Miller said great work and called it a powerful start. Susie Wiles, the White House Chief of Staff, she sent a longer message praising everyone involved, especially the people on the ground and at CENTCOM. Even Steve Witkoff, the Middle East Special Envoy, chimed in with a simple U.S., like a cheer.
Interesting how even someone like Witkoff, who's usually focused on diplomacy, felt compelled to, celebrate a military action.
Yeah, it does say something about the atmosphere at the time. And then you had Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, saying great work and effects. And it seems like everyone was, pretty happy with how it went down.
So a lot of back padding, even before the operation was fully over.
Yeah, pretty much. And then Hegseth himself confirmed that everything had gone according to plan, strikes were on time and on target, and they were getting good initial feedback. He said more strikes were planned for that night, and that he'd have a full report the next day. It's a lot to take in, you know?
It is. It's almost like watching a disturbingly casual live stream of a military operation.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So how did Jeffrey Goldberg, the journalist who was accidentally included in all this, how did he react?
Yeah, what was his take on all this unfolding in front of him?
Well, he basically described it as a really surreal experience. Seeing these messages come in, then checking the news and seeing that, yep, it was all happening just like they were saying. He specifically mentioned Hegseth's message about the timing and how the news reports confirmed bombings in Yemen around that exact time. He even talked about searching Twitter and finding news of U.S. air and naval assets hitting Houthi targets, just as the signal messages had predicted.
So confirmation in real time that what he was seeing in this private chat was actually happening.
Exactly. It must have been pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And what about the mood in the chat after the attacks? Was there any more discussion?
Yeah, Goldberg said there were updates about the results of the attack, the perceived impact. And, of course, lots of congrats flying around. He also mentioned the use of emojis, which is, kind of interesting.
Yeah, what kind of emojis?
Well, before the attack, someone posted a prayer emoji. And then after the reports of success came in, you had the flexed biceps emoji, the fire emoji, the American flag emoji. It's kind of jarring,
It is. It seems like a very casual, almost celebratory reaction to something that, is a serious military action with real consequences.
Yeah, there's definitely a disconnect there. So once all of this came out, what was the official response? Did they launch any investigations?
That must have been scrambling.
Oh, absolutely. The National Security Council, they put out a statement saying that the journalist being in the chat was a mistake, and they were looking into how it happened.
Standard damage control.
Yeah, pretty much. But President Trump, his statements on the matter, they were kind of all over the place.
In what way?
Well, at first he blamed a staffer, said someone had Mike Waltz's number in their contacts and accidentally added him to the group.
Okay, so passing the buck.
Right. But later on, Trump seemed to point the finger at Waltz himself, even saying to reporters, it was Mike, I guess. I don't know. I always thought it was Mike. And throughout all this, he kept downplaying the whole thing, calling the media reaction a witch hunt, and focusing on how successful the attack was.
So deflecting and minimizing.
Yeah, you could say that. Oh, and the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, she confirmed that they'd brought in Elon Musk's team to help with the investigation.
Elon Musk, what's he got to do with this?
Well, they wanted to figure out exactly how Goldberg ended up in that signal chat, and how to prevent it from happening again. And apparently, Musk's team was the best bet for that.
Interesting. So a lot of finger pointing, downplaying, and bringing in the tech guys to clean up the mess. But beyond the immediate fallout, this whole thing raises some serious questions about, the security and legal implications of all this.
Right. I mean, using a commercial messaging app like Signal for discussing sensitive government stuff, that's a big red flag.
Yeah, especially compared to the super secure methods the government usually uses.
Right. Things like SCIFs. Those are sensitive compartmented information facilities.
SCIFs, right, like in those spy movies where they have the soundproof rooms and all that.
Exactly. Those are designed to prevent eavesdropping and unauthorized access. No personal cell phones allowed, nothing like that.
And the concern here is that using something like Signal, well, it could expose that sensitive information to foreign intelligence agencies, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're actively targeting government officials' devices.
Makes sense. So if they were able to listen in on those Signal conversations.
Oh, that would be bad. They could compromise ongoing or planned military operations, put soldiers in danger, and even tip off the enemy. Give them a heads up about what's coming.
Wow. The stakes are incredibly high.
Oh, absolutely. Now, here's the big question. Did using Signal and sharing this information actually break any laws? Like the Espionage Act, for example.
Yeah, that's what everyone's been talking about. What's the legal take on all this?
Well, legal experts who specialize in national security, they've suggested that this Signal chat could be a violation of the Espionage Act.
Which basically deals with, spying and revealing secrets, right?
Right. Specifically, there's this section about being grossly negligent in handling national defense information.
Gross negligence. That sounds serious.
Oh, it is. It means that if someone's entrusted with national defense information and they let it slip out, either accidentally or because they weren't careful enough, they can be punished.
And they're saying the Signal chat might fall under that.
Yeah, potentially. There's this lawyer, Kevin Carroll, he used to work for the CIA, and he said this chat was 100% a violation of the law.
Wow, strong words.
Yeah, he didn't hold back. He even said that in any other administration, this would probably trigger a full-blown FBI investigation.
Really?
Yeah. And he went even further, said that if the people involved were, like, junior military personnel, they could face a court-martial. And if they were civilians, well, they could be prosecuted and potentially even go to jail.
Wow. So according to this expert, this isn't just a slap on the wrist kind of thing.
Not at all. And there's another legal expert, David Allen Sklansky, a professor at Stanford. He agreed that violating the Espionage Act was definitely possible, depending on what information was shared and how it was shared. He said that info related to military activities, especially stuff that the government keeps under wraps, that usually meets the criteria for being protected under the law.
Makes sense. And what about the gross negligence part? What specific things that happened in this signal chat are the most problematic, legally speaking?
Well, for starters, sharing operational details like the timing of launches, the types of aircraft and missiles they were using, things like that, with people who weren't necessarily authorized to know that stuff and doing it on an unsecure platform, that's a big no-no. It goes against the whole idea of need to know,
Right, right. And using a commercial app for this kind of discussion when there are secure government channels available, that also looks bad, right?
Oh, yeah. It suggests a lack of judgment, a disregard for protocol.
So basically, these experts are saying that this wasn't just a minor slip-up. This could be a serious breach of national security and a violation of the law.
That's the gist of it. And it gets worse. The Department of Defense, they have their own rules about using apps like Signal.
What did their regulations say?
Well, they basically forbid using unmanaged messaging apps, including any apps with chat features, for sharing DoD information that's not public, stuff that's not supposed to be out there.
So no Signal, no WhatsApp, no iMessage.
Exactly. They even put out a memo in 2023 specifically listing those apps as unauthorized for sharing this kind of information.
Wow, so they're very clear about it. And didn't the Pentagon issue a warning about Signal specifically just a few days after this whole chat thing happened?
Yeah, there were reports that they sent out a warning about a vulnerability in Signal, saying that Russian hackers were exploiting it to spy on encrypted conversations. Talk about irony.
Huge irony. So not only were they potentially breaking the law, they were also using an app that might have been compromised by a foreign adversary.
Yeah, not a good look. So, unsurprisingly, this whole thing caused a huge uproar, especially among lawmakers.
I bet. What were the reactions like?
Well, the Democrats, they were furious. They called it illegal, dangerous, reckless, you name it.
I can imagine. Anyone specifically?
Oh, yeah. Senator Elizabeth Warren, she said it was blatantly illegal and dangerous beyond belief. Representative Jim Himes, he's a top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, he said that if the reports were true, this was a brazen violation of laws and regulations. And Senator Jack Reed, he's another high-ranking Democrat on the Armed Services Committee, he compared this to something a soldier might do and said the consequences would be severe.
So they weren't pulling any punches?
Not at all. They were really laying into the people involved. Senator Chris Coons even said that everyone on that text chain might have committed a crime that could land them in jail, though he later deleted that post.
Wow. So the Democrats were pretty much united in their condemnation.
Yeah, you could say that. What about the Republicans, the ones who were actually involved in this whole thing?
Yeah, what did they have to say for themselves?
Well, their defense basically boiled down to two things. One, they said they didn't share any classified information.
Sure.
And two, they said the operation and the lives of the soldiers were never in danger.
So basically, no harm, no foul.
Pretty much. Rubio, he said that while adding the journalist to the chat was a mistake, the Pentagon had assured him that nothing in those messages put the mission or the personnel at risk.
So they're relying on the Pentagon's assessment of the situation.
Yeah, which, might not be enough to convince everyone, especially given everything else that's come out. Hegseth, he went even further. He posted on X, what used to be Twitter.
Right.
He said they definitely didn't share any war plans. He even listed what the messages didn't contain. Things like names, targets, locations, units, routes, sources, methods, classified information, all that.
But wasn't his message, the one with all the launch times and stuff, wasn't that pretty specific?
Oh, yeah, it was. It kind of contradicts his whole we didn't share anything sensitive argument. But hey, that's politics, right?
Right. Spin it how you want, I guess. What about other Republicans, the ones who weren't directly involved? Did they react?
Yeah, some of them, like House Speaker Mike Johnson and Senator John Kennedy, they basically brushed it off.
Yeah.
Johnson called using Signal a mistake, and Kennedy said, mistakes happen, it was no big deal. He even compared it to the Hillary Clinton email controversy.
Trying to deflect by bringing up a past scandal?
Exactly. It's interesting to see how people's opinions on this, even within the same party, differ so much.
Yeah, from this could be a serious crime to mistakes happen. It's a pretty wide range.
For sure. And speaking of Hillary Clinton's emails, Jeffrey Goldberg himself brought that up, pointed out the double standard.
Yeah, I read about that. What did he say?
He basically said that if this Signal chat is not a big deal, then the same logic should apply to Clinton's emails. If one is a minor slip-up, then so is the other.
Makes sense. Consistency, right?
Exactly. He even said, imagine if this had happened under a Democratic administration. Imagine if they'd used Signal to talk about a military operation and accidentally included a journalist. Would people like Pete Hegseth be so quick to dismiss it then? Probably not. He was calling out the hypocrisy.
Yeah, that's a valid point. It does seem like there's a different standard being applied here.
Definitely something to think about. And there's the whole issue of record-keeping laws, whether they broke those as well.
Oh, right. Didn't those laws say something about preserving official communications?
Exactly. Yeah. There are these federal laws, the Presidential Records Act and the Federal Records Act, that say records of official government business, communications, they have to be kept.
Makes sense. Transparency and accountability.
Right. But Signal, it lets you set messages to delete automatically, and reportedly, they had those messages set to disappear after 4 weeks.
So potentially destroying evidence?
That's the concern. The National Archives, they have guidelines saying that even if you're using a non-government system like Signal, you still have to keep those records.
So they might have been breaking those laws too.
Possibly. And there was an update to those laws in 2014 that gave federal employees 20 days to hand over records of any communications they had on non-official accounts.
So they might still have time to comply.
Maybe, but the fact that they were using disappearing messages in the first place, well, that goes against the whole idea of transparency and keeping a clear record of what the government's doing.
Yeah, not a good look. And Goldberg also suggested that maybe they were using disappearing messages on purpose, to cover their tracks and avoid scrutiny from Congress later on.
Makes sense. If there are no records, it's harder to hold them accountable.
Right. So potentially breaking record-keeping laws on top of everything else. What happens if someone's found guilty of that?
Well, the penalties can range from, administrative slaps on the wrist to actual legal trouble, especially if it looks like they intentionally destroyed or hid records.
So not something to be taken lightly.
Definitely not. Those laws are there for a reason. They want to make sure there's a complete and accurate history of what the government does, so anything that messes with that is a big deal. Now, there was also a Senate Intelligence Committee hearing where some of the people involved in this whole Signal thing, they had to testify, answer questions under oath.
Oh, right. I remember hearing about that. What happened there?
Well, it was a pretty tense hearing. Ratcliffe, the CIA director, and Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, they both said that they didn't share any classified information in those messages.
But didn't we just talk about how Hegseth's message with all the details about the attack was pretty specific?
Yeah, and a lot of people picked up on that. Senator Angus King, he's an independent. He's like, how can you say that wasn't classified? Especially when you think about what could have happened if that information had gotten out before the attack. But Ratcliffe, he insisted that no classified stuff was shared, ever.
So sticking to his story.
Yeah. And then you had Senator John Ossoff. He's a Democrat, and he really grilled Ratcliffe, told him to admit that they'd messed up big time. He called it a huge mistake, an embarrassment, said they were being totally unprofessional. He even pointed out that they hadn't apologized or even acknowledged how serious this was.
Ouch. So a pretty heated exchange.
Oh, yeah. And after the hearing, Goldberg came out and said that Ratcliffe and Gabbard were flat out wrong when they said no classified material was shared. So you have these conflicting accounts, these different versions of what happened, and it's up to us, the public, to try to figure out what really went down.
It's a mess. So we've got potential security breaches, possible violations of multiple laws, accusations of hypocrisy, and conflicting stories from the people involved. Where does this leave us?
Well, I think this whole incident has really exposed how the government communicates at the highest levels. It's raised a lot of questions about security, accountability, and whether there's a double standard when it comes to these kinds of things.
Yeah. A lot to think about. And for our listeners out there, we'd like to leave you with this question. What does this whole episode tell us about how the government operates and whether those in power are truly held accountable for their actions?
A question worth pondering, for sure.
Definitely. And that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive on Chain Opinion Podcast.